When Barron Trump gave up his first-class seat to an elderly veteran, no one expected the stunning family secret that would unfold mid-flight. What happened next left the entire plane speechless. The soft hum of airport chatter filled the terminal at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport that brisk morning. The pre-flight routine was in full swing. Passengers shuffling through security, last-minute coffee runs, the occasional frustrated traveler arguing over a misplaced boarding pass. At Gate 34, Flight 247 to Newark was preparing to board. It was a fully booked flight, every seat accounted for, the aisles destined to be packed with weary travelers just trying to get from point A to point B. Among the crowd of passengers was a young man seated comfortably in first class. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with an unmistakable presence, though his body language suggested he wished it weren't so. The name on his boarding pass? Barron Trump. Unlike others in his family, Barron rarely made public appearances. He kept to himself, avoiding the spotlight that came with his last name. Yet, recognition was inevitable. A few passengers had already taken second glances, whispering to one another in hushed voices. He sat by the window, flipping through the pages of a hardcover book, seemingly detached from the world around him. He wasn't scrolling through his phone like many others his age. Instead, he was absorbed in his reading, lost in his own world. But as fate would have it, his quiet morning would soon take a turn no one, not even Barron himself, could have anticipated. As the last few passengers trickled onto the plane, a man in his late 70s stepped into the narrow aisle, moving carefully, his silver hair neatly combed and his posture slightly hunched. He wasn't just another traveler. His worn military jacket, decorated with faded patches and medals, hinted at a history of service and sacrifice. Some passengers stole quick glances. A few whispered among themselves, "I wonder where he served," one woman murmured to her husband. Others, particularly the younger passengers, simply observed in silence, sensing the quiet dignity in his movements. The veteran clutched his boarding pass in one hand, a well-worn leather duffel bag in the other, making his way toward the rear of the plane. His assigned seat? 34B. It was an economy class seat, wedged between a talkative businessman who was already setting up his laptop and a restless toddler who squirmed in his mother's lap. He sat down without complaint, but the tension began to rise almost immediately. His seatmate, a middle-aged man in 34A, became visibly agitated. "I can't sit here," the man muttered, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His voice was just loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. The veteran, caught off guard, looked over in concern. "I'm sorry, am I in your seat?" he asked politely. The man sighed, shaking his head. "No, but... Look, I just need another seat." His tone was frustrated, impatient. The veteran hesitated, then apologized softly, though he had done nothing wrong. By now, passengers were watching. Some turned in their seats, while others exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening. In first class, Barron Trump's eyes flicked up from his book. He observed the exchange, his brows furrowing slightly. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. He watched as a flight attendant hurried over, attempting to calm the agitated man, whispering that they would try to find him another seat. The veteran sat stiffly, his hands folded in his lap, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Barron closed his book, and then, without a word, he pressed the call button above his seat. A flight attendant arrived promptly, offering Barron a polite smile. "Is there something I can do for you, Mr. Trump?" she asked. Barron spoke softly, his tone calm, but firm. "Can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The attendant blinked. For a moment, she didn't respond, as if processing what she had just heard. A teenager, a Trump no less, offering to give up his first-class seat for someone in economy? Passengers in first class had started to take notice. Newspapers were lowered. Tablets were set aside. Heads turned. A woman seated across the aisle leaned slightly toward Barron. "You don't have to do that, you know," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. Barron shrugged, offering a simple reply. "Some people deserve it more." It was just a few words, nothing grand, nothing performative, but they carried weight. The flight attendant quickly regained her composure. "Let me check," she said before making her way down the aisle toward the veteran. Barron stood, grabbing his carry-on bag, preparing to move. And just like that, the murmurs in first class grew louder. "Did he just give up his seat?" one man whispered. "That's not something you see every day," another passenger remarked. A few even reached for their phones, subtly snapping photos. But Barron seemed unaffected. His focus was solely on the man in the military jacket. Down in economy, the veteran looked up as the flight attendant approached. She knelt beside him, speaking gently. "Sir, the young man in first class would like to switch seats with you. Would you be open to that?" The veteran's eyes widened slightly. "You mean the Trump boy?" he asked, clearly surprised. The attendant nodded. The old man hesitated. He turned in his seat, glancing toward the front of the plane, where Barron stood waiting. "You sure, young man?" he asked, his voice weathered but strong. Barron simply extended a handshake. "I want to," he said. "Thank you for your service. Please, take my seat." There was no hesitation in his voice. Passengers watched intently, the weight of the moment settling over the cabin. Slowly, the veteran stood. He extended his own shaking hand, clasping Barron's firmly. "Well, thank you. That's mighty kind of you." His voice cracked slightly with emotion. As the veteran made his way to first class, something remarkable happened. The whispers stopped. The murmurs faded. And for a brief, powerful moment, the entire plane sat in silent admiration. As Barron settled into his new economy seat, he adjusted his tall frame to fit the tighter space. He didn't look for recognition. He didn't expect thanks. He simply opened his book again. But up in first class, the veteran sat carefully in his plush new seat. A flight attendant offered him a drink, a warm blanket. He exhaled slowly, adjusting the armrest with slightly trembling hands. And as he gazed toward the back of the plane, toward the young man who had just reminded him that kindness still existed in this world, he had no idea that this flight was about to bring one more revelation. A revelation that would leave everyone on board speechless. Passengers in first class glanced up from their newspapers and tablets. Their curiosity piqued. The young Trump's offer was unexpected, especially in a world where privilege often went unchallenged. But his expression was earnest, and his tone left no room for negotiation. "Let me check," the flight attendant replied, her voice carrying a note of surprise as she walked briskly toward the back of the plane. For a moment, a hushed silence fell over first class. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. A woman across the aisle, dressed in a sleek business suit, leaned toward Barron. "You don't have to do that, you know," she said, her voice tinged with confusion. "You paid for this seat." Barron simply smiled and shrugged. Some people deserve it more. It was a simple statement, uncomplicated, sincere. But somehow those 5 words carried a weight that settled over the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances as if reevaluating the young man in front of them. Who was he really? Not just a name on a boarding pass, not just the son of a former president. At that moment, he was simply a person making a choice that very few, a few rows ahead, an older gentleman lowered his reading glasses, watching with quiet intrigue. "You don't see that every day," he muttered to his wife. Meanwhile, the flight attendant moved swiftly down the narrow aisle, her mind still processing what had just happened. She had been working in the airline industry for years. She had seen celebrities, politicians, and billionaires walk onto planes with an air of entitlement, expecting the world to cater to them. But this was different. She reached row 34, where the elderly veteran sat quietly. His hands rested on his lap, his aged fingers brushing over the fabric of his well-worn military jacket. When he noticed the flight attendant approaching, he looked up, his tired eyes calm but questioning. She knelt beside him, lowering her voice. "Sir, the young man in first class would like to switch seats with you," she said softly. For a second, the veteran didn't react. Then his brows lifted slightly, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "You mean the Trump boy?" he asked, his voice carrying the unmistakable gravel of age and experience. She nodded. A pause. The veteran let out a slow breath, glancing down the aisle toward the first class, where Barron still stood, waiting. He studied the young man for a moment. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice steady, but with a hint of disbelief. The flight attendant offered a small smile. "I think he is, sir." The veteran hesitated, as if debating whether to accept such an offer. For men like him, accepting anything, especially something he hadn't earned, was not easy. But there was something genuine about the boy standing near the front. Something that told him this wasn't about charity. It was about respect. With a slow nod, he exhaled. "Well, if he insists, I suppose I won't say no." The flight attendant smiled, and then, with measured movements, the veteran began to rise. Back in first class, Barron adjusted the strap of his carry-on bag, preparing to make his way toward the back of the plane. And as he took his first step into the main cabin, something remarkable happened. The whispers grew louder. Passengers nudged each other, exchanging wide-eyed looks. Some reached for their phones, subtly snapping photos, not out of disrespect, but out of sheer astonishment. Is he really giving up his seat? A teenager? Did you see that? Barron seemed unaffected by the attention. His focus was solely on the elderly man standing near row 34. As Barron moved down the aisle, the contrast between the two men became evident. One was young, tall, and privileged, yet choosing to step away from comfort and exclusivity. The other was aged, weathered, and full of unspoken stories, yet about to be given a moment of dignity and recognition he never expected. And when they finally stood face to face, the moment felt heavier than words could express. The veteran looked up, meeting Barron's gaze. The young man extended his hand, his expression calm, but filled with sincerity. "Are you sure, young man?" the veteran asked, his voice strong but hesitant. Barron nodded once. "I want to." And then, with quiet conviction, he added, "Thank you for your service. Please, take my seat." The words were simple, but the way he said them carried a depth of meaning that couldn't be ignored. For a brief second, the veteran hesitated, not because he didn't want the seat, but because something about the moment felt larger than himself, larger than either of them. And then, with deliberate movement, the old man reached forward. His aged, weathered hand clasped Barron's firm grip, a handshake, one that held decades of unspoken words, one that bridged generations, one that silenced the entire plane. As the veteran turned to make his way toward first class, the reaction was almost instant. A man near the exit row straightened in his seat, eyes lingering on Barron, as if seeing him in an entirely new light. A young woman near the window wiped at her eyes, whispering something to the passenger beside her. And then, as the veteran took his first step toward a first class, a soft scattering of applause began. At first, it was just one or two passengers, then a few more, and before long, the sound grew. Soft claps, acknowledgement, appreciation, not for Barron Trump, the name, but for the gesture, for the simple act of human kindness that had just unfolded before their eyes. As the veteran settled into first class, a flight attendant offered him a warm towel, a small act of hospitality. And as he sank into the plush seat, a thought crossed his mind. How many times had he flown before? How many flights had he taken over the decades, returning from deployments, traveling to bases, moving from one station to the next? Too many to count. And yet, not once had he sat in first class. Not once had anyone insisted that he deserved it more. And now, he looked toward the back of the plane, where Barron had just settled into his new economy seat. The young man wasn't looking for validation. He had simply opened his book again, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and neither of them knew it yet. But this flight wasn't just about a seat. It was about to change everything. "Well, thank you. That's mighty kind of you." The veteran's voice, though firm, carried a note of unspoken emotion. As he made his way toward first class, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Some were still grasping what had just happened. A young mother in row 15 leaned toward her teenage daughter, her voice hushed, yet filled with awe. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "He just gave up his seat." The daughter nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on Barron as if watching something rare unfold. A businessman seated nearby, who had been reviewing emails on his laptop, glanced over. He lifted an eyebrow, shaking his head slightly. "Never seen anything like that on a flight," he muttered, half to himself. A small pause. Then he closed his laptop, leaning back into his seat, as if for the first time in a long while, something other than work had captured his attention. Meanwhile, Barron Trump, standing tall in the cramped economy aisle, didn't appear to be seeking attention. He simply slid into the now vacant seat, adjusting his frame to fit the tighter space. For someone accustomed to luxury, the change in seating should have been uncomfortable. But if it was, he didn't show it. There was no shifting, no sigh of regret, no indication that he was anything but at ease. Instead, he just opened his book again, flipping to the page where he had left off. It was as if nothing had happened at all, but everyone knew something had happened, something extraordinary. A flight attendant, passing by, paused for a moment, her brow furrowed slightly, as if she wanted to say something, perhaps offer him something extra. Instead, she simply leaned in discreetly. "Is there anything I can get you?" she asked, her voice low and thoughtful. Barron looked up briefly, offering a small, polite shake of his head. "I'm fine, thank you." And that was it. He returned to his book, completely unbothered by the whispers and glances surrounding him. In first class, the veteran settled into the plush leather seat. For a moment, he just sat there, still, processing. His hands, scarred by time and service, rested on the armrests, his fingers brushing against the smooth fabric. He exhaled slowly, as if he had forgotten what comfort felt like. A flight attendant approached, offering him a warm towel and a complimentary drink. She bent down slightly, speaking in a tone that carried both respect and admiration. "The young man said you should have this seat." The veteran looked up, his eyes softening, a long pause. Then, almost as if he was speaking to himself, he murmured, "It's been years since I've been treated like this." He wasn't talking about the seat. Not really. He was talking about recognition, about being seen. He reached for the glass of water, his hand trembling slightly as he took a sip. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he glanced back toward the economy section. Barron was still there, still reading, still unfazed. No grand gestures, no expectation of gratitude, just a boy with a book, one who had quietly changed everything. As the plane taxied onto the runway, something unusual settled over the cabin. It wasn't just that the boarding chaos had calmed. It was something deeper, something unspoken. Passengers, who had been buried in screens, now sat with their thoughts. The businessman, who had barely looked up from his laptop earlier, now stared out the window, his expression pensive. The young mother, who had been distracted by her restless toddler, now seemed unusually still, her gaze lingering on Barron. Even the flight attendants, seasoned professionals, who had seen it all, moved with a quieter reverence. It was as if a small shift in the universe had taken place, and everyone felt it. The engines roared to life, and within moments, the plane lifted into the air. For many, the story should have ended there. A kind act, witnessed and admired. Something that would live in whispers long after the flight had landed. But fate had other plans, because just when it seemed like everything had settled, the veteran spoke. And what he said would turn this flight into something no one would ever forget. The veteran's voice, though not loud, cut through the hushed cabin like a blade. He turned toward the flight attendant, his gaze distant, as if seeing something from long ago. "You know, I met his grandfather once," he said suddenly. The attendant paused, tilting her head. "Pardon?" The veteran nodded slowly, as if unlocking a memory buried deep in time. Then, speaking just loud enough for the passengers nearby to hear, he said, "Fred Trump. I met him. A long, long time ago." Several passengers glanced up. Fred Trump, the patriarch of the Trump family, Barron's grandfather. The veteran's fingers trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. A small, faded photo emerged, creased, worn by time. He held it up for a brief moment. In the grainy black and white image, two young men stood side by side. One was the veteran himself, his uniform crisp, his expression stoic, and beside him, a young Fred Trump, shaking his hand. The cabin fell into silence. Passengers leaned in, straining to hear the next words. "He helped me once, too," the veteran murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Many years ago, when I needed it most. He didn't have to, but he did." He looked back toward Barron, who had now glanced up from his book. Their eyes met, and for a moment, it was as if time itself stood still. 2 generations, a single act of kindness, and a legacy that had come full circle. The plane soared through the clouds, carrying its passengers toward their destination. But for many on board, it was no longer just a routine flight. It was a reminder that kindness echoes through generations, that a single moment, one simple choice, can create ripples that stretch across time. Barron Trump had given up a seat, but in return, he had gained something far greater, a story that had been waiting decades to be told. And as the veteran sat silently in first class, staring at the faded photo in his hands, he whispered the words no one expected to hear. Like grandfather, like grandson,